Welcome to the New View. This is August in 2025, and you can see everybody's name on the screen for our team. And then our special guest today is Dr. Kris Feder. And I have a guest here beside me, my friend Kumudini Mayur from Maryland in India. So she's joining us as another guest, but our speaker is Kris Feder. And Kris taught at Bard College from 1991 to 2023. She holds a PhD in economics from Temple University and a BA in philosophy from the University of Pennsylvania. She served on the boards of the Robert Schalkenbach Foundation, the Henry George School of Social Science, and the American Journal of Economics and Sociology. She's a contributing author to the book Corruption of Economics, which I've often mentioned, that shows in Elizabeth has the book. She's well familiar with how the story of economics got corrupted when it was solving the wealth inequality problem, and they decided they didn't want to solve that problem. So the elites created the neoliberal economics, right? So she's got that story straight. So, Kris, welcome. I know you're joining us from where you live in Maine, and just go right ahead to. No, you're not in Maine anymore.
Massachusetts.
You're Massachusetts.
I
Okay.
live in I'm proud to say, the smallest city in Massachusetts,
Which
where
is?
which is North Adams. If you look on the map, it's in the top left corner.
Okay.
Oh, it's
That's
probably
pretty
beautiful there.
rural.
Well, there are mountain views from every window.
Wow.
Oh,
Oh, and since, well, here you want, I'll mention my personal situation since you asked, and since you mentioned something about land value taxation already. If North Adams were to shift to land value taxation as the Georgists recommend, I would be a big loser because when I retired and moved, sold my house in upstate New York near Bard College. It's only about an hour and a half away from here. But you can see why I came here, what with the mountains and all. But I have almost 6 acres, and I bought it for about half of what I sold my other house for, which, right? And this one includes a barn. And several of the acres are lawn, flattish, and buildable, but okay for croquet if that's all you've got. And then a couple of wooded acres that are probably too wet for building, but provide a nice barrier to the outside world around. Okay, so that's what I've got, and if the value of I've spent more to fix up this 100 and whatever it is year old building than I paid for it in the first place. It's called the fixer-upper, right? So there's a huge investment of my not only financial capital, but my labor in making this house livable. And it's still not to the point where I would, God forbid, invite any of my friends to come over, from Philadelphia or somewhere. But the land is an enormous attraction, whether you are rich and want a croquet field for your friends. Oh, and I have a great big garden and a greenhouse going, and I have 2 mini pigs that live out there. And, I kind of brought my farm here uh, as well. But, all that would be the costly part because I'm taking up land and I'm also making it so that everybody who wants to get from point A to point B, like which is the big Y supermarket, has to drive past me back and forth every time, spending time and gas money to get past me and any other large lot, right? That reduces the density of this so-called city, right? I am pretty close to the next county line. It's walkable up there, right? And but I am also a mile from the Big Y and the CVS pharmacy. So if it weren't for the hill, I'd just bike it there and leave my car parked in the driveway, which is about 500 feet long and has a turnaround big enough for a large delivery truck, right? So that's my situation, is exploiting the failures of our public policy. And I'm happy to do so, since nobody listens to me or us anyway. Look at the number of people listening here today, right?
This is our team that's normally, Kris, let me describe. This is,
my point I'm making, I'm being
okay,
facetious, but my point is simply
okay.
that the Georges, for all our validity, have not been able to overcome the countervailing pressure from the corruption of economics. And that's a long story, right?
So dig into the housing issue a little more. What's the problem? Why can't
Okay, so
we afford housing?
Yeah, in the Wall Street Journal, during the election campaign, a fellow named Michael Solon wrote an article called "Housing is the Sleeper Issue of the 2024 Campaign." I didn't think it was a sleeper issue, since I'd been hearing a lot about it. But in any case, the reality is, in every single decade since the 1950s, and the internet can tell you this, they've talked about a housing crisis. We have a perennial housing crisis, like sort of like Trump's crisis of crime or crisis of immigration. This is permanent, but all of a sudden, because we've just noticed it for the first time, or something like that. Tim Walz, in his acceptance speech for the vice president nomination, he declared, "Healthcare and housing are human rights." Housing, human rights. I always wonder what Aboriginal people 15, 20, 30,000 years ago would say about the notion that healthcare is a human right, or housing. But never mind that. We've been talking about this for decades. And today, at least, the biggest problem is the lack of supply. And everyone seems to agree on that. There's plenty of demand for housing. There's more demand than supply, or at least the fact that supply is so low relative to demand means that prices are very high, historically high, and continuing to rise. If you picture supply and demand diagram, shift the supply curve to the left, what happens? The equilibrium price of housing goes up while the equilibrium quantity falls. We don't have enough housing to bring prices down or to slow the rise in those prices, right? In particular, there seems to be a shortage of homes for people of middle income and low income. And this includes rental housing, as well as little starter homes for young people, or small houses for elderly, retirees, widows and widowers, and so on. Also, mother-in-law additions that you put in behind your garage or what have you, or multifamily housing, as well as just rental housing that's affordable. We don't have enough of that to bring prices down. I've seen a lot of estimates about how many houses we need, and of course that all depends on so many factors, not just the facts, but how you understand what a home is. But maybe we need, let's say, 6.5 million homes. That's sort of a middle estimate from what I've seen. I can tell you that there are housing affordability and rental affordability indexes that are now at about 30-year lows, and that if you combine the average home price with the 30-year mortgage rate, and then you figure out lifetime payment of what that all adds up to, it's a little over $961,000, which is $513,000 more than it was since the start of the Biden administration. So that's not quite doubling the cost of housing, but we're pushing that, right? A house that costs, I don't remember where I got these statistics, so don't quote me on it, but $303,600 in January of 21 now would be $422,600. I think that's sort of supposed to be a median idea. But anyway, that's a 4.4% increase in home prices from June 23 to June 24. Right, and I don't know what it is in the past year, but we do know this: mortgage rates that were 2.8%, 3%. I bought this house with a mortgage rate of 3 point whatever it was percent, and I only had to pay it for a little while until I sold my previous house and paid off the mortgage. But still, now it's 6.5%. It was 7% a few months ago, right? Who can pay that, right? Whatever the purchase price is, if you don't have the cash, if you have to take out a mortgage, right? And down payments are going up too lately because of these high costs, right? And going back a few years, you might recall the crash of 2008, which started with a big real estate crash. And after that, we were all, having hard times. Interest rates were driven down to record lows, right? That's, we were still in it when I was able to buy this house, right? But with those very low interest rates, what happened? Home buyers came rushing in, right? To get a house while the mortgage was cheap. But even then, there wasn't enough housing because apparently for decades, the United States has been chronically underbuilding relative to growing need, right? Not only does population grow, but as Americans become wealthier and our cars get better gas mileage, we want bigger houses on bigger lots farther out into the forest and mountains. Excuse me, right? Again, it's only 1 mile to the supermarket, so. But anyway, so this is where we are, right? We had bidding wars because there weren't enough houses, and if there are not enough houses for all the people who are looking for them, right? The people not only bid higher, but they would skip doing the inspections, they'd try to close a deal as quick as they could. And there were markets where home prices climbed to absolutely record levels, right? Reminiscent of 1928 Florida and other places, right? Some of it was, not all, but some of it was big corporate developers buying up both residential and commercial land. You may have heard right after the California fires a few months back, the owners who had lost everything and just had the burnt out land were pressured to sell their land to developers who saw the opportunity to buy up large tracts of land and redevelop it if and when they felt like it, because the destitute owners of those shell lots couldn't afford to rebuild. And even if they were to rebuild, the insurance costs would be sky high, right? So all of these, natural disasters that both reduce the amount of land that's safe to build on and raise the insurance cost of hurricanes, and the insurance cost of a home in Florida is getting to be so expensive. That's another story we hear, right? So land prices just going up and up and up. And, the most hopeful speculative buyers think they're never going to crash, and those are the ones who sort of lead the market toward the crash, which is due next year on the theory of the 18-year real estate cycle, right? But that's another hour of conversation, right? But here's the thing. With these high costs of land and of homes and the scarcity of homes, that we should be building them. But in the meantime, still today, as 50 years ago, as Mason Gaffney reported 50, 60 years ago, a whole lot of our most valuable, best located urban land is either vacant or might as well be vacant because the building is abandoned or wholly underutilized. Maybe there's a little shop on the first floor that can't make rent and empty upstairs and so on. That's what North Adams is like. A lot of, it's a beautiful old city. Most of it is abandoned or nearly so, or shops that used to be thriving small city shops are now, selling things to tourists and whatnot, little, things that that nobody wants, but that therefore nobody else sells. You know what I mean? So we have this, it's a housing crisis, which extends all the way through the city and it becomes connected to the use of our commercial spaces. And a big part of it is that local governments control land use. They regulate land use with zoning, especially in the cities, but everywhere. The subdivisions in the suburbs, right? They all have their zoning practices to keep density low, to keep poor people out, right, to not overcrowd the schools and so on. And so we have a whole system of taxes and subsidies that makes it so that the people who leave the city and occupy farther out on cheaper land get to exploit some of the advantages of the city through cross subsidies, meaning, I pay the same price to send a letter to my friend in Philadelphia as I would if I still lived in Philadelphia and sent the letter from 4 blocks away through the post office, right? The price is the same. I could send a letter to Anchorage, Alaska for the same price, right? And that's just one example, utility pricing, electricity pricing, and so on. We make that all the same price for everybody so that the people who have really long commutes and live far, far away are compensated by these cross subsidies that are paid for because the people who live in the city in tight, compact spaces use it costs much less to serve them with the linkages like the roads and the sidewalks and the street lights and the electricity grid and the water and sewer. It costs much less per capita to serve people who are living densely together, maybe 30, 40, 50 stories high on top of each other, than it does to serve the suburban and exurban people. But we make sure that the powerful landlords who are the wealthier classes siphon off the surplus that a well knit tight city generates. But sadly, that includes, as I was saying, a whole lot of lands that are vacant and underutilized in the city, right? A big part of it is the regulations that make it so difficult to build. It takes years to get a permit and this and that and the other thing. A big part of it is simply, the large issue of inequality in the United States, which is extreme, right? The housing is a major form of intergenerational wealth. but only if you can buy it in the first place. And the wealth gap in the United States is at historic levels. Credit card delinquencies are at record highs while corporate profits are exploding, right? And of course, housing hardships are experienced differently by different classes of people. It's really more severe among Hispanic households, Black households, younger households that are more likely to face eviction or foreclosure than older white adults like me, right? And we have here wealth inequality. The top 10% of Americans control 71.2% of the wealth. Now own about $40 trillion in wealth. And a lot of that, if it's not directly in real estate, it's in financial derivatives that are based on mortgages that go down 3 or 4 trading steps based on land and property, right? And so these are ultimately claims on real wealth. So 40 trillion in wealth to the top 1%. The United States national debt just hit a record high. Anybody know what that was? Did you hear? 37
trillion.
$37 trillion, right? So the top 1% could buy out the federal debt and have enough money to live on for several generations more without working, right? That's kind of how it looks. And it's way beyond the scope of this discussion to talk about the fiscal policy and especially the monetary policies like quantitative easing and so on that have systematically over the decades raised asset values like land values and the values of those derivatives, right? The mortgages and all the derivatives derived from these asset values, right? So we have policies working harder to make people who have assets wealthy relative to people whose income comes not from owning something, but from working, right? There's really only two ways to add value to what nature provides, right? You work and you wait, right? For my lawn, for instance, I mostly just wait for it to grow. I hardly have to work. I cut it once in a while. For my garden, it's a lot more work because I have to do seeding and all of that stuff, right? So there are different amounts of work and wait, right? If I want to raise chickens, I have to wait a few months. If I want to raise cattle, I have to wait a couple of years, right? There's a cost to waiting because, in the meantime, you could be doing something else if you didn't have to wait, right? But we have policies where overall labor is taxed at very high rates between income taxes and Social Security contributions and what have you. Capital gains, especially long-term capital gains, which come from waiting, are taxed at much lower rates. And if you have unearned, or I should say unrealized gains, that is from an asset that grows in value, but you never sell it, well, the whole time you don't sell it, you pay no taxes on the increase in value that you get from waiting, right? So the way we tax income and wealth is systematically designed to further enrich those who already have a step on the ladder of wealth. The wealthier you get, the faster your wealth can be made to grow. So that once we have a couple of billionaires, somehow seems like a billion is not much different from a million. Well, it's 1,000 of those, right? And it's just this is much to do with the way our system works. through our policies and has little to do with the actual labor productivity of different people, right? Much more to do with their access to what nature provides and their control over what other people do through these institutions that they set up, right? So we now have homelessness, right? We're talking about homelessness. We mentioned that before we began. Trump is on a mission to remove the homeless encampments from Washington, D.C. People are asking, where are they going to go? I read that there are over 5,100 homeless people counted in DC, which is actually a 9% decrease compared with 2024. That's from Mayor Bowser. And HUD, Housing and Urban Development, they say that the number of people in DC, homeless people, was 83 per 10,000 that year, which was the highest in the nation, but only a little higher than New York and Hawaii, which were 81 per 10,000. And then California, which we hear so much about, had a rate of 48 per 10,000. So about half of that, or a little more, right? But on the other hand, the Washington, D.C. Did a better job of sheltering those many, many homeless, according to this HUD report. Something like 84% of the homeless people were in shelters, and most states had much lower rates of sheltering. In California, it was only 1/3 of the homeless population were in shelters. Of course, maybe you could say the weather's better in California, but I'm not sure that that accounts for much of it. So, sleeping issue of the 24 campaign, I don't know. Kamala Harris had a housing plan, and I took note of it at the time. Gosh, that was a year ago. Where does the time go? You may recall, she talked a lot about the opportunity economy. It sounded like George Bush's ownership society from a few years back. He wanted an ownership society, which I suppose he meant everyone should have a house or some equivalent material asset that they could call their own, which makes sense given that everything I just mentioned, right? So opportunity for Harris meant, here's a quote, middle class economic security, stability, and dignity. And she equated to a large extent wealth building with home ownership, right? Because home, after all, is that intergenerational wealth that can be passed down, and most buildings will stand there for a couple of generations before they fall down of their own accord. She said that corporations are colluding to raise rents and using algorithms to maximize their profits. She wanted to do away with that. She promised, she said, we will build 3 million new homes, which, as you know, if we need 6.5 million new homes, that would be a good start. She didn't say a lot about the details of this. You can't really go down into the depths in a campaign speech, but she offered up to $25,000 to support down payments for the first-time home buyer. So instead of having to borrow from mom and dad to buy your first house when you're 38 years old, you get a little help from Uncle Sam, right? She wanted also a $10,000 tax credit for first-time home buyer. So whatever your taxes roll around, you get a little breather there the first year, right? And then she spoke about providing tax incentives. Not sure what that means, but tax incentives for builders that are building starter homes and selling them to first-time buyers, right? And there's already a tax incentive for building affordable rental housing, but she would have expanded that. She talked about a new $40 billion innovation fund to spur innovative housing construction. And she would even repurpose some of the federal land for affordable housing. Again, these algorithms, price setting tools that landlords use to set rents, she would ban those. In fact, she would cap rent increases to no more than 5% per year. Think that through. And then also, for investors who were buying up large numbers of single family homes, they would get no tax benefits. I'm not exactly sure what would change there because I'm not an expert on those particulars of taxes. But that in other words, long story short, she took it seriously and she spoke about it repeatedly at length, and you can probably still find it in her online stuff. Elizabeth Warren, you remember her, Senator Warren. She interviewed on Inside with Jen Psaki about a year ago. She said, and I quote, "We need housing for everyone, and we've known for decades. It's the number one it's the number one way that families build wealth for the next generation and close the racial wealth gap." Howard Dean, former governor of Vermont, he said that vacant housing is being bought up for speculative purposes. Marcia Fudge, she used to be the secretary of HUD, Housing and Urban Development. She was saying that housing affordability is a huge problem with average home prices rising 10% per year. Corporations, she said, own almost a third of housing in some areas, and U.S. housing prices are the highest in history. Right? Now, most economists would have to concede, as the Georges would say, that if you give a subsidy to first-time home buyers, first of all, you're helping middle-class people who can afford to pay for a home under any circumstances, not the lowest income people. And second of all, if there are favored areas, it's going to raise land prices because the landlords can all extract the surplus. Now that it's cheaper for you to buy a house, you're willing to pay a little more for the same house. Well, only if everyone else does the same thing. It has to be region wide, right? It can't be just you plopping down into some community with a special 25,000. That would be like you inherited $25,000 from your grandmother, and you can therefore outbid everybody else in the local market, right? But if it went to everybody, the landlords would know it. And they could say, okay, the price just went up $25,000. What are you going to do about it? Right? So that's the problem, is land it tends toward local monopolization. So you have to increase the housing supply first, right? Or the subsidies are just going to raise housing prices and slowly, if at all, do anything to actually make more homes, right? Okay, Robert Reich was President Clinton's labor secretary. He had an article about this one not too long ago, how Wall Street priced you out of a home. He said, well, after the 2008 real estate bubble burst, hedge funds and private equity firms bought up lots and lots of housing on the cheap. After those bailouts, they could buy at fire sale prices and make cash offers. So investment buyers, said Reich, may control 40% of single family rental homes. These are not just big investment buyers, by the way. These are mom and pop investment buyers too. That second house that you buy across the street or that you inherit, whatever, and you rent it out to supplement your income, right? But single family rental homes are a big lot of that. But he said Wall Street bankers are targeting a really huge proportion of affordable homes, especially in the Sun Belt and in communities of color. They buy up houses and convert them to rentals, which of course means they keep the rising land value accrues to them as long as they so choose, right? So lack of supply, big problem, but Wall Street is making it worse, right? Says Robert Reich. And his solution is to bar hedge funds and private equity firms from buying homes, right? One might add at least think about using land as collateral for loans, since land is so variable in price, in part subject to the interferences of banking institutions, right? But that takes us beyond Robert Reich into Mason Gaffney. But the point is, the major economists have taken notice of this. And whatever they may say about it, at least it's on the menu as an issue that voters really do seem to care about, right? I heard an interview with him on the TV machine. He said, the economy is much more concentrated than it had been. And he spoke about corporate monopoly pricing power, which has brought us these record high stock prices and CEO pay. He talked about oil monopolization. He said ExxonMobil is colluding with other big players all around the world to push up oil prices, right? Which is, of course, a big part of land rent ultimately, and an important consideration in whether you have a 45-mile commute or a 40-second commute from your home to your workplace, right? No, so inflation has slowed down. It may be picking up again in the Trump era. But even while inflation was slowing, past few years, housing prices kept going up. This is Robert Reich. Interest rates had risen since 2022. And he pointed out homeowners who have a big mortgage, but at a low rate, they don't want to sell. If that means taking out a mortgage for your new house at a high rate, right? So maybe you've got a 30-year mortgage, you're 15 or 20 years into it. You'd kind of like to upgrade or move to a different town where your cousin Anthony lives or whatever it is. But you think, oh my gosh, if I buy a new house, the interest rate will be so high, it'll be like I just threw away everything I've invested in this house. And it's starting over again. And I don't want 30 years of 7.5% or whatever his mortgage rates. I'm too old for that. So it's, housing started falling back in 2007 before the crash, and they haven't recovered despite the high prices. A lot of it is local regulations that limit development, because the NIMBY idea, right? People say, well, we need more housing. We especially need more housing for the poor, for the disadvantaged. We need housing close to shops and recreation, but not in my backyard. Oh, no, we don't, because I like my minimum lot size zoned residential 2.5 acres or whatever it is, right? But that doesn't fully explain it, especially because those NIMBY considerations could quite readily be overcome at the regional or state levels, where you not only the suburban landowners, but also the urban residents are included in the decision making all across the state, right? Those kinds of local resistances could be overcome with different structures, right? The problem, of course, is that those who control the local landowning oligarchy will always do everything they can to resist ceding the power to shape public policy in ways that might be less than beneficial, right? So the point is, these people who could, companies who could, bought a lot of land at very low long-term interest rates after this great financial crisis, when the Fed was holding rates low for years to promote recovery. And using cheap credit, they were able to speculate in land, which means it was so cheap that they could afford to take a little bit of risk and hope that the land would appreciate in this bull market after the crash, which of course mostly it did until it doesn't again, right? But they have the private equity firms who step in as sort of middlemen and take the risk of holding the land, and if it's so if it falls in value, then the big builders come out on top, but they also regain the right to buy the land back. It's very, very complicated. But a cartel of landowners could hold land supply off the market to keep out smaller developers. And so he's pointing out that there are these financial middlemen that in the modern age of the computer and the internet become ever more sophisticated. They contract everything out. They buy cheap land. They hoard it. It makes it hard for small wannabe builders to get land at all, because the larger builders are hoarding the good lots. And those low interest rates, that's not so great if you're just a little small wannabe builder and you don't have access to loans anyway, right? We're going to give you a loan. What do you got to, what's your collateral, boy, right? If they have a little land, they already, they might sell some of it to finance building somewhere else, right? Like, maybe I could sell off 2 acres of my back lot, and and I could renovate the barn, which I haven't started on, with whatever I get from selling that, right? That kind of thinking, it works differently for people who are already on the wealth ladder, right? So there's not enough supply. What are the barriers to having more supply? With all this price pressure, basic economics would say, good grief, that high price should elicit a frenzy of building, because who wouldn't, if they could, want to take advantage of the high price you could get for a house these days if you only made one available, right? There may be only so much land, but there's plenty of places to build more or better housing, right? So barriers to supply. One would be local control, as I said. Another is the cross subsidies, as I talked about earlier, the postage stamp pricing. Another one Alanna can tell you all about is the property tax, the fact that if you build on a lot, excuse me, I need to drink water. Your property tax goes up, But if others build around you, around your vacant lot, making your vacant lot more of a nuisance and an obstruction in the city, like mine is, then your land value tax will go up. And that's an incentive to tell you to do something, move or get out, right? Don't leave your backpack on the seat next to you on a crowded train when there's people standing up and looking for a seat. Switch over, right? That's what those pricing signals would tell you under a reasonable tax regime, right? So, insurance, of course, rising insurance course is a barrier to supply, and speculation is this sort of cyclical barrier to supply. And remember, we have speculation in lots of things, but if people speculate in goods that can be produced, then somebody's going to rush to produce more of them, right? Oh, the rains washed out the orange groves in California. All of a sudden, we're producing more citrus in Florida than ever before, right? But with land, no matter how high the price goes, they ain't making any more of it. And that means that eventually, that when that price starts to turn, that land prices start to turn, the people who are left holding the bag will be those who were the most optimistic or who had the lowest costs of, the lowest interest costs, the lowest carrying costs. The speculators will be the ones who lose out big in the ensuing crash, right? So this is where we are. We have zoning laws and the car culture. We have the remnants of the urban redevelopment programs of the 50s and 60s that basically didn't really make way for the kinds of housing that we would need still today. We need especially what they call middle housing, right? There's I used to teach urban economics. It was called the filtering model of the housing market. The idea, sort of like trickle down theory, right? The idea is that a new house, because it's new, is going to be expensive, and the people who have the most wealth are going to be the ones who buy it. But that's okay. That's not unfair, because as soon as they do, they have to move out of their old house, which then filters down to people who can't afford the really nice new house, but could afford one that's 20 years older. And they move out of their old house, which is 20 years older than that, and so on. So it's like a ladder. Everybody takes a step up the ladder, right, when the new housing is built for the people at the top of the ladder. And that means even people at the bottom of the wealth ladder or at the bottom of the housing ladder will ultimately get better housing when there's more housing, even if they have no hope of ever occupying a new house, because they will move up the rungs, right? Now, this model kind of works. It works really well if every generation has the same population and same preferences for housing and that sort of thing, and so that there would be a good fit. But it also, you have to think about what housing means, because in our world where Donald Trump is evicting homeless encampments from the parks, the bottom rungs of the housing ladder are not the, shabby little one-bedroom apartment in the city, right? It may be that tent in the park or a cardboard box in the subway station, right? That where the housing affordability index is and the availability index is such that if we're 6.5 million homes short of what we would need to house everybody, that kind of means there are 6.5 million unhoused. Of course, there's intermediate things in there like homeless shelters and 40-year-olds living with their mom and dad in the attic and things like that, right? So this is where we are. Whether it's a sleeper issue or not, whether it's a crisis or a chronic issue, I vote chronic. It's kind of a big issue, and it's a big issue for a lot of people, whether they really understand the big picture, the national picture, or whether they're just focused on their neighborhoods. I guess I can stop there. What else you got? You got questions, comments, thoughts, stories to tell? Yeah,
Yeah, hi.
Diane?
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
I have one very short comment and then a more detailed one. But I've had issues with my HOA and I have a lawsuit and that's a long story. Well, I'll be brief about that. But when I was testifying I testified 9 times in DC Council to the housing.
Oh my Lord,
There
you
was
poor woman.
also about toxic mold and about legal abuse and of condo owners
Uh-huh,
and health issues.
uh-huh.
But just as a practical thing, this guy, local guy, activist, he suggested, why don't they have like better designs, like apartments that maybe have like 6 bedrooms and like more common area, but they're designs that they could easily do that would make it more affordable. So I mean, that stuck in my mind. That was years ago. And the other issue is that I've learned everything the hard way, but I don't know if you're familiar at all with the HOA issue and the Community Associations Institute. So,
Haven't heard of that, no.
all right, so the CAI, Community Associations Institute, is a network of like tens of thousands it's a trade organization of like condo lawyers, management companies, collection agencies, and
Oh,
they have thousands of people and they're designed to extract money from homeowners. And they give courses on, like how to write letters and get fines and how to foreclose on people, how to cheat homeowners. And they also have legislative action committees that are, and the chairs and the vice chairs are like, they lobby DC like the council. So I had the great misfortune in my condo building, which had toxic mold and disabled me, and then they retaliated against me. But the condo lawyer, her name was Jane Rogers, and like 10 years before I moved in, there was another lawyer. There were like no lawsuits in the building, and then when there were like 12 lawsuits in the building, and she told the board not to deal with mold and retaliated. Anyway, it's a very long story. Alana knows a lot of it. And but anyway, what I discovered when I was calling everyone in the government, like just to deal with the mold in the building so I could live in health and peace. And they said, oh, why don't you ask the Legislative Action Committee? So I looked that up and it turned out that my condo lawyer was the chair. And every time I testified, she was testifying. There was like in 2014, there was a condo owner rights bill proposed by Muriel Bowser, now our mayor, who was chair of the housing committee at the time.
okay,
All
okay.
these lawyers, these CAI lawyers testified like it was a right to mediation before foreclosure. So they were all just, oh no, foreclosure, we don't want that. It's a burden on the association, like total bullshit.
Right.
But anyway, I discovered she writes the legislation for DC Council. And when they have owner rights, like she marks it up. I have a copy of a bill where all the rights are deleted and change the legislation to advantage them. But anyway, for relevant to what you're talking about, they're buying up all these like huge swaths of land. It's an involuntary membership organization. Like you buy a condo, like I moved to DC from Philadelphia. I'm a Philly girl. And my kids and grandkids are in Philly. I go often. But like I moved to DC, I'm not going to be able to buy a house. But I sold my house in Philly and I could buy a condo and I wanted to be near the think tank. So I had no idea. Like there's entrapment and then there's legal. I mean, it should be an ideal way to live. But there's, I mean, there's a lot of stories. I did, the last 2 years, I did a panels at the Whistleblower Summit on HOA capture and abuse, entrapment. But anyway, like in Nevada and Colorado and California, they're buying up these huge swaths of land
Right.
and the development, and they'll say, and when you move to like if you get a job in one of those states, it may be hard to find a house. So you buy, they have swimming pools, they have community, and it looks like a great thing. Of course, you have the condo fees, but like once you're in, they control, like there are lawsuits over like they don't let you paint your door a color or to have an American flag or to plant a tree, like really stupid stuff. But also, anyway, they're buying up all this land, and once they capture, then you have to they have the HOA, and you have to be a member of the HOA. And anyway, if you want, there's a woman, Sue Bartholomew, she has a radio show called On the Commons about all of this, and they're lawyers. And but anyway, it ruins a lot of lives. So FYI, if you want to know more about that.
I have a friend who's about 10 years older than me who's been talking about selling her condo and moving up here somewhere for the last ever many years. But I don't see her getting out. She's kind of unhappy. She doesn't like her neighbors, yada yada yada. And it's just you don't own the land. You don't necessarily choose your neighbors, or you have to put up with close living, right?
You don't have control over your environment.
Yeah, right. You get the way your pets or your paint, right?
Or toxic, being exposed to toxic molds.
Yeah. Well,
Renters have more rights than
that's true for I had that issue as a urban renter when I was in college, right? That happens all the way down to the subway station cardboard box housing, right? Yeah, yeah. It's not just a shortage of housing per se, it's a shortage of or a lack of control over our immediate environment for so many of us.
But also, I think I have a lawsuit against my HO. I mean, this has been going on 20 years, but I think I have a RICO case. I think there's a racket, and I think I
Really?
have a lot of evidence that. Anyway, I don't know if other people have other questions. I don't want to hog the
Yeah,
top.
let's see. Thanks, Diane. Let's see if others people have input, questions, comments. Thank you. Good luck with your HOA lawsuit.
Yeah.
Liz or Ginger, any
Yeah,
thoughts or
yeah,
input? Okay.
I definitely, have some thoughts. I think especially with what Diane contributed, because here you have people who actually have housing and have horrible problems. So it really is showing the profound level of the problem goes way beyond just housing. That we're looking at, and when we're dealing with BlackRock and all of the BlackRocks, buying up everything. It's kind of like we're back in the 19th century, okay, sort of, in the rise of industrialization, when these filthy rich individuals obviously, took over all of the, like the trains and the superstructure development that was really, as we all know, was the investment that the whole country's making, and these individuals basically got to benefit from it individually. And that obviously, led to the rise of Henry George's movement, for goodness sake. It was pretty obvious from the popularity of Henry George's book and his own popularity and his solutions, that people knew what the solution was. And as you said yourself, we're dealing with a problem that is still a problem. And I think that, I like to remind people you can't make major changes at the end of a process. You've got to make your changes at the beginning of the new process. We're coming to the end of something. And all the ideas represented by Henry George are part of our future. That's where they will blossom, but we are still coming out of this unbelievable burden of the, of this the final stages. And I like to actually make one quick point about a lot of people describe this as the end that, the imperialism basically is what's ending, and that is the final stage of capitalism. Well,
Yeah.
it's obviously based on Henry George's solution. I have come to determine it isn't based on capitalism, and imperialism existed before capitalism. So we know that what imperialism represents, this ability to keep taking seems to be something that we have been living through the whole evolution of this imperial mind that we are all experiencing, and coming to some realization that we really obviously have to come together on. And it seems our biggest problem is coming out of the burden it puts on us, on the one hand, to actually come together with all these wonderful solutions that have been out there all along, that have been supported. I think Alanna's given wonderful presentations that I've attended on sacred economics and how long-standing, these ideas have been with us, but they have always been shunted and put aside. So I think that would be, my comment would be that, we're what we might hopefully be getting to is the reality of being able to bring forth these new ideas. I mean, these old ideas,
The old thing, right?
yeah, that actually have proven themselves over and over and over and over and over again. But what was the problem that always seemed to come into play? The ability of the ones who wanted to take more for themselves, and were in a position to do it and did it. I think, we're sitting there saying they did it again. I think what you're describing, in terms of the condo market. I mean, I remember years ago hearing the downside of condos. And many of the things, Diane, that you're talking about, I remember that years ago, and it was something that people had no idea. It all sounded so wonderful. How did it go so bad? Well, it's the same way that Henry George's solutions were jettisoned by neoliberalism, basically just overwhelming the entire educational system. So so anyway, that would be my comment about that. I think we have to look to coming out of this stage somehow and staying alive to the real solutions, and trying to help everyone who is recognizing that we can't live like this. There is something that is that has got to change, and these solutions are going to help do it.
Well, look, there are reasons to be hopeful. One is that these days, thank you, Donald, there's all this public open talk about the big questions of how you organize human beings politically on the globe. And we're talking about everything from democracy to autocracy, fascism, oligarchy. The latest one, they're now saying the United States is now a system called state capitalism. Thank you, Donald, right? So we're debating these big issues, which means that there may be, as you were suggesting, openness to, sort of fresh thinking from out the side door or whatever, right? But the other thing is that they're saying that AI, artificial intelligence, is going to be gobbling up something like 25 or 40% of our electricity in the near future. And meanwhile, we're trying to eliminate or slow the use of renewable energy because those windmills are so unsightly, right? So we're running up against, for so many reasons, what could be uh, sort of an inevitable public reaction, right? And I will call your attention to my favorite book of the past few years by Neil Howe called The Fourth Turning is Here. And he's a demographer and a historian, and he's looking at the cycles of human history.
Mm-hmm.
And he identifies 4 stages of a recurring cycle. So the fourth turning is the last one. And it's kind of what you were getting at.
Yeah.
It's where we, sort of, well, we tried everything else and now we're here, or something like that. So big changes are afoot, and he will tell you in these next few years, right? Right, we're on it, right? We're in it. So we'll see if he's right. But I would commend that book to all of you if you are looking for something that's both fun and thought-provoking. Neil Howe, Howe, The Fourth Turning is Here.
Good. I wrote it down. Thanks, Kris. Ginger, do you have any input? You're muted. Ginger's in Florida. Diane is in.
There you
all
go.
right. Okay. I find this is really good. This problem has been, this housing problem has been around a long time. And back in the 70s, I was poor and with my first husband, and we played part-time in the local symphony, and the rest of the time, every morning we'd get up and throw newspapers, and we'd have to collect the paper. It wasn't like it is today that you just go out and throw the papers. We had to collect, and we had to sell the papers, and all that kind of thing. And so I ended up reading a lot of newspapers, and even in the 70s, and this is in the Tampa Tribune in Florida, that they had a whole column on HOAs and condos and questions, and I would, just kind of flipping through the problems with HOAs, the problems with condo owners, the issues, the legal snafus, the financial issues, and so on, as well as, and then we paid $40 a month to live in a shack when it rained, we had to put out pots. So we had about 5 leaks in our 1-bedroom shack. And the cracks were so big, we had house spiders this big. It was Florida. And they never mowed the yard. So we had weeds that were up to our waist, so we had to drive in and drive back so we could kind of get the weeds down so we could walk to the door. It was, and so as far as I was concerned, everything was cheap. We were able to pay our rent and so on. And everything changed. Everything changed when I divorced and moved to Miami, and I met my current husband, and we bought our first house in 1981, and our interest rate was 16%. Okay. and I actually had gotten into right-wing stuff because of my satsang group, and I got into alternative medical and health and stuff because the right wing always had this kind of like rogue alternative, medicine thing. And I voted for Reagan, and I was absolutely pissed when Reagan removed his solar panels off the White House. The first day he was there, I was like, well, damn it. And I realized I had been betrayed by great marketing. What happened after that was so tough to get through that time period. We had to refinance like twice in order to survive because the cost was just so extremely high and everything. So it I felt that as far as housing is concerned, that that really the pressure to really make something of yourself, to be able to afford your own place, it is such a huge challenge. And so when Daniel and I decided to leave California and we looked for a place in Florida, we have 5 acres now. We bought a house on 5 acres. We're out and we're not in the farms really, but we're not in the suburbs either. We're kind of just outside there. And
Exurbs.
the
Like
exurbs,
exurbs.
that's the good term. Yeah, we're in the exurbs. And we made very sure when we were looking for houses, we very sure that there was no HOA, that was active here. And supposedly there is, but they said, "Oh, we don't do anything. Whatever you want, whatever." So it's absolutely so informal and so on. And that was so important for us because even since we've been here, our and the this was just after this was in 2021 we bought the house. So it's been 4 years this month that we bought the house. Uh, since we bought the house at 3% interest.
Yeah.
And it's just like and we just at the very end of 3%. Click, we got it. We locked it in.
Yeah.
Yay.
Yeah.
So we're in this in wonderful position. And we're also seeing, what if we want to leave here? It's going to be really tough.
That's exactly right. Yeah. I'm in the same
and and
place. Yeah.
and there was a bidding war on this place, okay,
Mm.
and we feel that uh it was divine intervention that we got it because there were the other people were offering more. One guy wanted to wanted to pay cash. We paid the asking price as is, and we were able to get it.
I think Jerome Powell would be very flattered by your insinuating his divinity.
I personally don't think that he had much to do with it. We work with our spirit guides, and they'd been working for 2 years to find this place for us.
Well,
divine
look, I bought around the
hands.
same time for about the same rate in an entirely different part of the country. So,
Very good, very good. Yay.
Okay, hey,
Okay.
thanks
Thank you so much. Yes. Mhm.
for
thank you for putting up with me and listening. I really do think that if you once you start noticing, you'll realize that this is really being talked about all over the place,
Well, I'm
locally and
glad. They
nationally.
really
Yeah.
does need to be. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Well,
we're not quite done yet. We're going to have at least another 5 minutes, maybe 10, I think, to wrap up. But Liz, you had spoken. Do you have something short that you wanted to add? Because I certainly do.
yeah, right. Yeah. No, I just wanted to, restate what I feel is important, that
Yeah.
I think that all the work you have done, all of you Georgists, is absolutely critically important. And but understanding why its time was not back then, it's now. Okay. And I think that there is a reason it's now, because we are seeing the collapsing of the old architecture and old ideas. And one of the things I just wanted to make this last statement about Henry George that I really felt was so important in understanding. Henry George proved to me that the whole thing about communism and socialism, which became the argument against capitalism, was basically always rejected because of the property rights issue. That was the fundamental problem. People didn't necessarily not want social spending, but it actually became this issue. And you mentioned Reagan, who used it perfectly, welfare queens, anybody who got anything, billionaires getting billions of dollars, it's not welfare, but when, an individual poor person gets something, it's welfare. So I think that a lot of the propaganda that's been used over people for years and decades and generations, I think has finally reached its end, and people are looking at the evidence. So I think it's time.
So the fourth turning is here.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep. Mhm, yeah.
Okay, so thanks everybody. I want to talk about quickly some real life stuff that's important that's happening in Baltimore, Maryland. You may or may not know that it's been about 3 years since we launched Baltimore Thrive to work for the property tax shift off of taxing buildings and houses and other of the built environment and production and onto the land value. So we have a coordinator there, and we have a team that meets every week, and we're making some headway. But most recently, the land economics research group has looked at this issue of all these vacant lots throughout most of our cities.
You're losing
In the poorer areas of Baltimore, can you hear me okay now?
Better.
You have about 1/3 or 2/3 are renters and about 1/3 are homeowners. And you're going to see that in a lot of the poor areas of localities. And then you have this problem of vacant lots. And what they saw was the vacant lots are they're underassessed in terms of value, grossly underassessed. The assessor just doesn't value the land correctly. So the vacant lot is paying almost no taxes, so no property taxes, which means that the speculators have a field day, the land hoarders. You don't have to pay anything to the government practically to do nothing. Again, we're back to the doing nothing but waiting so that maybe others will start improving the surroundings and then enhance and increase your land value. So hoarding is speculative problem. So the fact that they did this really good research showing that it's all about $500 million that Baltimore is losing because they're not charging a full fair assessment on these vacant lots. And who is it that's paying that? And it's the people who keep their houses and fix up their houses and keep their property nice. So it's a very easy, I think, simple to see that this is a gross inequality. Once you start taxing those vacant lots and those boarded up buildings, you're going to get the owners to do something with them or sell it to somebody who can. Or even if the government takes over, the government could then lease out the land, collect the full land value rent, and then let people build without charging for the buildings. They could, piece by piece, on these vacant lots that were released, begin to do affordable housing. But I think the solution we need to emphasize here, because Kris so well described the parameters of the problem and what we're up against and the various shenanigans that keep housing unaffordable increasingly to more and more people, which we're not going to be an ownership society. We're going to be one where you own nothing and you're supposed to be happy about it, right? So that's where we're headed with the gross wealth inequality that is growing and growing. So in a nutshell, what we who work outside and beyond of this old neoliberal economics corruption, and we work for the Georgist ideas and the classical original economics that had land, labor, and capital. Our view morally and ethically is don't tax for the good things. Don't tax on your labor and your production, and you fix up your house, you grow your gardens, whatever you do. That's like a taking from your labor. So don't let the government steal from your labor through taxes on income and production. But the land value itself is a whole different thing. Land essentially should be viewed as a commons because no human beings made the land, made the earth. So by deepest ethic, it should be fairly shared as a human birthright, the fundamental human right, the being the human right to the earth. So as society began to live in settlements and cities and the land values grew, that became privatized. That land value went to whoever got there first and grabbed the land, grabbed the best land, and then they had surplus value that then they could loan out, and then you have the banking problem where the few are living by these usurious interest payments. So we want to shift the tax base from local and all levels on the surface land, oil and minerals, anything that's nature given. We want to shift that tax base to the land value only. And that land value being created by society, by the community. When you build schools and housing, you have fire protection, you have infrastructure. That's a community collaboration. Those are social benefits reflected in land value. The land value should naturally be captured by government, collected as a land value tax, shared with the community equitably, finance your infrastructure, your education, your schools, whatever society needs. And this is what the revered economist that Kris and I have known for years, and she co-wrote Economic Corruption of Economics with Mason Gaffney, so clearly showed that in this land rent, this land and resource value, there's more than enough to pay for societal needs and probably enough left over to give even some direct citizen dividend payments to everybody as their fair share of the now fairly valued commons. So it's really a direct and nonviolent solution that says share the land and resources through the fiscal policy, the tax policy of a commons rent or a land value tax. And then the freedom there's the fairness towards the human relationship to the land. And the freedom then enables individuals to be really, really free. There would be more jobs available than people to fill them, which means that labor is going to have a strength over what it has now. If you can say, hey, take this job and shove it, you're not paying me enough to do that kind of work. That's possible when there is always access to land. All right. That's why I love the idea of ecological villages in rural areas where you have settlements that are fairly self-reliant, that if you can't get a good living in the city, you have someplace to go to where is a community living in a community land trust. So there you go. The other movement that was spawned by Henry George's work was the community land trust movement. Mm-hmm. So that's all I'll say there. But to simply just hold that is very simple. Don't tax people, don't tax production or labor. Shift the tax base to the land and resource value. And that's where we're spawning movements worldwide. And it's been implemented to some degree very successfully, showing that it works. But now we want to really get 1,000 of these projects going worldwide in 2 years. So everybody can chip in. So how's that as putting the solutions in a nutshell, Kris? Would I pass? Could I get a PhD?
Yeah, that works for me.
Awesome. That was great.
But look,
word. Uh-huh.
You made me think about my garden, and I feel very pleased to report that when I grow my own food as opposed to buy it in the supermarket, I am not paying taxes on that labor.
Exactly. Okay, so I think we've had probably more than an hour, and I think we did it, right? Everybody feel completion? I want to thank again my friend Kadin. Put your face in here.
What?
I still haven't heard what her name is, because every time you say her name,
Kumudini. Kumudi.
Oh, okay.
Kumudini.
You are phasing, by the way, when you move.
Yeah, when you move, the sound moves out.
Kumudini means lotus flower. Lotus flower.
Yeah.
That is,
You can't hear her.
Can't hear her at all.
When you were talking about the water dripping inside your house, you reminded me of many people living in Bombay whose house has all this water and everything coming, and they have to get rid of all these things, and they cannot sleep, they cannot do anything, because we have about 4 months of rains there. From June to September. And about the HOA, here where I live, I had a problem. They came about my storm door, my garden, and all those problems. They came up, they wanted to charge me, but then I found a way how to get out of it. Because they came later, and I've been there for 30 years. So I said I took permission from the older people, the earlier person who was ruling there. So I said I've already taken the permission, which I had not done because they never had all these rules then.
Right.
So I had put a storm door, I had removed some grass and had grown flowers and other things. So they wanted to charge me for all that, but I said I've already taken the permission. So anyway, they didn't have any of those papers of 30 years, so they didn't say anything. So I was safe from the charges.
Oof.
Yeah.
No, the housing problem is worldwide, pretty much
Yes.
everywhere. And that's why it's so important to understand the housing problem is the land problem at source and the whole new economics that we're all going to bring into place. So great. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Kris, very much for being
Thank
with
you.
us.
Thank you for your
Thanks.
patience in listening and for your ideas and questions. That was interesting for me. Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.